Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akiridoluale. The headlines. U.S. spy drone allegedly crashes into waters after Russia intercepts it over Black Sea. U.S.-Australia reacts to drone incidents as Russia is not, quote, playing by the rules. Plus, Russia denies downing the American spy drone even as its ambassador arrives at the U.S. State Department in response to a summons. We'll begin with the news that an American MQ-9 Reaper surveillance drone was forced to crash into the Black Sea yesterday after two Russian fighter jets performed what the United States called a reckless intercept. It was the first such incident since Russia's invasion of Ukraine over a year ago and drew condemnation from the White House and the Pentagon, which warned of the risk of escalation. U.S. Army General Christopher Cavoli briefed NATO allies about the incident. The U.S. Air Force said the drone was conducting a, quote, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or ISR mission. The U.S. military said the incident followed a pattern of dangerous behavior by Russian pilots operating near aircraft flown by the U.S. and its allies, including over the Black Sea. The White House said the drone's downing was unique and would be raised directly with Moscow. Meanwhile, the Pentagon has said the United States military was forced to essentially crash that drone because of the damage caused when it was struck by a Russian jet. Press Secretary, Air Force Brigadier General Pat Ryder said Russia had not recovered the crashed drone yet. General Ryder confirmed during a news conference that the U.S. State Department was directly raising concerns about the incident with the Russian government.
Has Russia recovered it? Is there a U.S. naval asset in the region that could undertake that recovery? Thanks.
Yeah, so again, I'm not going to get into the specifics of what's on this particular aircraft, other than, again, it's an ISR platform. Because of the damage, we were in a position to have to essentially crash it into the Black Sea. To my knowledge, at this point in time, the Russians have not recovered that aircraft. But again, in terms of our recovery efforts, don't have any updates to provide right now. You know, we are continuing to assess exactly what happened, but I think based on the actions of the Russian pilots, it's clear that it was unsafe, unprofessional, and I think the actions speak for themselves. What we saw, again, were fighter aircraft dumping fuel in front of this UAV, and then getting so close to the aircraft that it actually damaged the propeller on the MQ-9. We assess that it likely caused some damage to the Russian aircraft as well. So in terms of Secretary Austin talking to his counterpart, not at this time. To my knowledge, DoD officials have not spoken specifically to Russian authorities on this particular incident. I do know that the State Department is raising our concerns about the incident directly with the Russian government, so I'd refer you to them for details on that.
General Pat Ryder, the Pentagon spokesperson. Meanwhile, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has called the incident that led to the crash of that surveillance drone another reckless act by Russian President Vladimir Putin and his military. Senator Schumer called on Mr. Putin to stop the behavior before he is the reason for an unintended escalation.
U.S. surveillance drone that was... Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Now, earlier today, two Russian military aircraft conducted an unsafe intercept with an unmanned U.S. surveillance drone that was operating within international airspace over the Black Sea. This intercept was so dangerous and so brazen that the U.S. Air Force was forced to crash their drone into international waters. It is another reckless act by President Putin and his military. And I want to tell Mr. Putin, stop this behavior before you are the cause of an unintended escalation. We have seen this behavior from the Russian military before, and it will not deter the United States from conducting operations over the Black Sea. These aggressive actions by Russian aircraft are risky and could lead, I repeat, to unintended escalation. The U.S. has routinely flown over the Black Sea since before Putin's illegal and reckless invasion of Ukraine, and I'm confident our military will continue to do so.
And Australia's Defence Minister Richard Marles says that Russia is not playing by the rules following the encounter with the U.S. drone. Although no lives were lost, but it was a reminder of the risk of direct confrontation between the United States and Russia over Ukraine.
International law. The American drone was operating in international airspace in accordance with international law. We see interactions between militaries in international airspace on the high seas, but there's an expectation that those interactions will occur in a professional way. And what's clear here is that Russia has not acted in a professional way, and that has resulted in the downing of this drone. Once again, this is an example of Russia not playing by the rules, and that's actually at the heart of what's happening in the conflict in Ukraine. What Russia has done in the invasion in Ukraine is a complete flouting of the United Nations Charter and a complete disregard for the global rules-based order, and the event that we've seen overnight is just another example of that, and Russia has much explaining to do.
Meanwhile, a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Tom Caraco, has called the incident a provocation. He says it certainly sounds like a Russian pilot was horsing around and deliberately trying to destroy what they're saying was a U.S. MQ-9 drone over the Black Sea.
Well, look, it certainly sounds like a Russian pilot was horsing around and deliberately trying to destroy what they're saying was a U.S. MQ-9 drone over the Baltics, over the Black Sea, rather. And so this is a provocation. It's probably something of a test. The Russians, of course, don't like the fact that we're flying, admittedly, in international waters there, and they're expressing their displeasure. So it's pretty obvious why they're doing it. It's clearly an irresponsible act, nevertheless. And so we'll see how it develops. Yeah, so the news reports are an MQ-9. That's probably an MQ-9 Reaper. I'm not sure exactly the model, but these are, frankly, some of very widespread, widely used, let's just call them trucks that can carry any number of payloads. They've been used in the war on terrorism for Hellfires, but also for ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance to surveil and spy. But again, these are essentially versatile UAV trucks, and you can put all number of things on them. But it's a pretty common drone. Well, unfortunately, the Russians kind of think of the Black Sea as their own lake. Legally speaking, it is international waters. They don't really like that fact, but it certainly, from an international law perspective, insulates the United States from any kind of allegation that we were into Russian airspace or something like that. Well, there's been quite a lot of drone and counter-drone activity in and around Ukraine, just absolutely tons of it. And it's really been, I would say, one of the most widespread conflicts with not merely UAV but counter UAV activity, and so it's really advanced the activity, but continued the activity we've seen in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict from a couple years ago and the like. I will say also there's another precedent to think about here, and that is, I think it was during the Trump administration, Iran shot down a U.S. Global Hawk, which is a very large drone that we use for surveillance. We were operating from international waters there as well. Sadly, the United States did not respond. President Trump chose to countermand a kinetic response to that clear shoot down of a U.S. aircraft. And as a result, you saw an escalation of Iranian activity in the months that followed that led up to back and forth the targeting of Soleimani. And then after that, the firing of Iranian ballistic missiles into Iraq at U.S. bases. So I don't think that this is going to lead to that, but nevertheless, I do think it suggests the need for some kind of firm and clear response on the part of the United States. I think number one is going to be the firmness and the clarity with which the United States responds, identifying it. We don't want our own weakness or indecision here to be perceived by the Russians as an encouragement to try something else and test us on something else. You've had so many statements over the past year about, defending NATO territory and all these other things. We don't want any kind of in the gray zone kind of activities to further test where exactly that line is.
In the meantime, Russia's defense ministry says that its fighter jets did not come into contact with a U.S. drone that crashed into the Black Sea earlier. The defense ministry of Russia said, quote, the Russian fighters did not use their onboard weapons, did not come into contact with the UAV and returned safely to their home airfield. The statement also adds, quote, in the morning on March the 14th, the Russian Air Force detected an American MQ-9 drone flying in the direction of the state border of the Russian Federation over the Black Sea near the Crimean Peninsula. The drone flight was carried out with its transponders turned off in violation of the boundaries of the area of a temporary regime for the use of airspace established for a special military operation, communicated to all users of international airspace and published under international norms to identify the intruder. Fighter jets of the usual air defense forces were set airborne because of sharp maneuvering around 9:30 Moscow time. The MQ-9 drone went into unguided flight with loss of altitude and collided with the water surface. The Russian fighters did not use their onboard weapons and did not come into contact with the UAV, and as has been said before, safely returned to their airfield. And the Russian ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Antonov, returned to Washington, D.C. after spending almost 3 months in Moscow. It comes after U.S. President Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin agreed to send both their ambassadors back to their posts during their meetings in Geneva last week. State Department spokesperson Ned Price said the U.S. ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan, will return to Moscow this week. Mr. Price said the administration welcomed the news of Mr. Antonov's return to the United States and noted that Mr. Sullivan was returning to his post in part because the United States remains committed to open channels of communication with the Russian government, both as a means of advancing U.S. interests, but also to reduce the risks of miscalculation between our countries. Mr. Antonov said that he was in an optimistic mood before returning to Washington after the Biden-Putin summit. Meanwhile, Ambassador Antonov says Russia does not want confrontation with the United States after he was summoned to the State Department following an incident that led to the downing of a U.S. Reaper drone over the Black Sea. Mr. Antonov said, quote, we prefer not to create a situation where we can face unintended clashes or unintended incidents between the Russian Federation and the United States. Mr. Antonov said Assistant Secretary Karen Dunford conveyed the U.S. concerns about the incident and that he exchanged remarks on the issue because they have some differences. He also claimed that Russia had informed about the space that was identified as a zone for special military operations. And let's take a break. After the break, Vladimir Putin says the United States was interested in undermining the Nord Stream investigations. Details in a moment. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. A warm welcome back. Let's bring in now senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the Babcock University, Dr. Michael Ogu. He joins us virtually from Elisha Remo in Ogun State, the site of the university. Good morning to you, Dr. Ogu. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, good morning, Ladi. Thank you very much for having me.
Now, this was bound to happen eventually. I mean, that it took this long before it happened would probably be the surprise. This drone incident. Now, both sides have different versions of what transpired. The Americans are saying the Russians acted recklessly. The Russians are saying that the Americans approached their border where there's an active military operation going on, and that they did not notify the Russians or turn on transponders that would identify that drone, and so they had to interject it. So at the end of the day, this is stories that is still unfolding. But does it remind you of the Chinese balloon that the U.S. shot down a couple of weeks ago?
Yeah, Thank you very much for that question, Ladi. So the whole issue with what is going on, right, with Ukraine, Russia rather, and the U.S., and of course China coming in at certain points, just reminds me of the Cold War, and the very many instances where there was almost a push towards the using of nuclear weapons by the superpowers during the Cold War, because that's what we can see playing out very in very mild forms, and of course if care is not taken, that could blow out of proportion, and just like you said, the Chinese balloon that was blown down by the US, also was mysterious, and of course we have not gotten any further details as to what that balloon was intended for, and of course the purpose that it had in the US airspace, and now again, of course this is slightly different because the US drone was actually flying in international airspace, and of course it is the word of the Russians against the US now, because we don't know all the details about that incident yet, which is something that we need to find out, exactly where was the drone flying? Was it inside the Russian airspace, or was it actually on international airspace, as it is claimed? But of course, if these kinds of provocation continue, then it is very likely that the war will take a different turn. Because of course, if these superpowers get directly involved, if the US gets directly involved, or if there's any kind of provocation that leads to any kind of response that would change the dimensions of the war, that would be something that we will not want to see happen. So I think that both sides need to tread with caution, and of course Russia now is more or less fighting like a wounded dog, just trying to pull down as much as it can on its way, which is what I think. But I think there still needs to be a lot of caution, going forward.
Now, the Americans, and I'm happy we referenced the balloon incident previously. That balloon was actually flying in U.S. airspace, and then, of course, the U.S. shut it down outside of landed area to minimize or remove the possibility of casualties on the ground. And as you pointed out, we don't know what has become of that balloon, what was found, and all of that. The story is, hibernating at the moment. Now, in the case of this drone, of course, we know that drones are used for surveillance, but they're also used to attack. And so, again, the risk of escalation, which you referenced, which several times we came close to during the period of the Cold War, is again here, because the Russians' account of the story is that this drone was approaching Russian airspace, was approaching the Russian borders. That's the Russian version of the story. And of course, before anything could happen, the Americans themselves brought down the drone into the Black Sea. So the question of who recovers it, is it the Russians or do the Americans have assets in the area? That was the question asked to the defense spokesperson there in the clip we played before coming to you. And he said he couldn't provide an answer at the point. Now, what do you think? The Russians will recover it because the Black Sea, I mean, the Russians have a lot of assets there because of what's going on in Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, this is of course a military,
Indeed,
it's possible
indeed, yes.
security. But my best guess would be that the American government would be able to get the Russians, will be able to get to talk to the Russians, to see how that will be recovered. Because like you have rightly pointed, the Russians have more assets in the Black Sea region than the American government will have, I think, because of course it is a territory that is closer to their own to the Russian state. So I would want to think that I won't think that the Americans would speak with the Russians, and then see how that could be recovered. But I think also that the move of the Americans to crash that drone appears a little bit suspicious, unless the drone was damaged beyond its capacity to operate further or to be more efficient in its operation. I think that crashing the drone into the Black Sea at that point it appears a little suspicious. But like we said, it appears that there seems to be talks between the foreign ministers of Russia in the US and all of that. So I think that they should find some kind of common ground or agreement on how the drone could be recovered, and then whatever investigations will be made after that should also be done to ascertain the real situation of things in this case.
Let me bring you to the war in Ukraine itself and how this kind of incidents can impact that war. You talked about the fact that America and the Russians are talking. The Americans say they will let their concerns be known to the Russians. The Russians say they don't want any confrontation, but that this is what happened and all of that. So how much do you think that kind of diplomatic activity between the Russians and the Americans on one hand could play into the conflict in Ukraine, which is the, shall we say, trigger of everything else that is happening at this point in time? But that, so far the Americans are, talking at the Russians are talking at the Americans, but they're not talking to each other about what's going on in Ukraine.
I mean, Ukraine, like we have always said, Ukraine is just the scapegoat in this instance, because this is a conflict that is way beyond Ukraine as an entity. It's a conflict. It's a conflict for. It's a struggle for. It's a struggle for ideology, basically. And I keep saying that it appears to be a repeat of the Cold War. The Russians want to hold on to their communist and socialist, and doctrines, and the US also wants to advance its Western ideologies. So it's something that is beyond Ukraine. Ukraine just happens to be the grass where the two elephants are fighting. And of course, as the war has continued to drag on, we are beginning to see now manifesting, the real actors in the conflict, which of course is Russia, the US, and China coming in, at several intervals. All right, so I'm not surprised that all these conversations are not directed towards Ukraine, even though Ukraine happens to still be, the battlefield where the bombs are going off, where the infrastructure is collapsing and all of that. But it is obvious that the real actors in this conflict are the ones who are talking to each other now.
Notably Russia and a couple of the neighboring countries, the likes of Poland and so on, that are in the immediate vicinity of the current theater of conflict. But then that brings me to a question that would seem obvious to ask, but which people have not really asked. Is the momentum with this conflict still between Russia and Ukraine, or are outside parties now dictating what is going on even within Ukraine? Because when it started just over a year ago, it was more or less it was Ukraine versus Russia. And the West came to Ukraine's aid because they said Ukraine, suffered an unprovoked attack and that on its own, it couldn't withstand Russia. But now, as the war has ground on, Ukraine seems to have, gotten some leverage. So Russia now also needs partners. And so you have China, Iran, Venezuela, and so on, North Korea, all stepping up on the side of the Russians. So I ask the question, is it still within the ambit of Russia and Ukraine to decide how this conflict goes and how it ends, because inevitably it must end at some point.
Yeah. Yeah, of course it must end, and we're hoping that it ends soon, because I mean this is the 185th day, if I'm not, or 35th day, if I'm not mistaken. So it's dragging quite a lot. But back to the question, the war was never, in fact, indeed, between Russia and Ukraine. It was something bigger, that just manifested in that very. So the Russian invasion was just a trigger of something that was a lot more complex. Which of course we're beginning to see unfold now, because all these other states that are backing Russia, you mentioned Iran, North Korea, China, they are on one block, all right, and those who are backing Ukraine are on another block. So you are beginning to see now. Of course, when the war began, all these other states were trying to be diplomatic, were trying to stay aloof and not make any comments so that it doesn't appear that they are taking sides with one party or the other. But now they're becoming bold to take sides, actually. So it is unfolding that the plot is a lot bigger than just Ukraine and Russia. And of course, in terms of negotiations and ending this conflict, it cannot be Russia and Ukraine alone anymore, because of course on the side of Ukraine has become so overwhelmed, and like you said, there are other parties calling the shots now. There's Germany, there's the US, of course, which have always been a very there's the UK, there's France. There are other parties who are calling the shot now, and of course Ukraine has to ensure that it keeps relationship with these allies, because if it loses that, then it is doomed. So the plot is bigger, yes, and hopefully, if we're going to see an end in sight, then of course it's going to be a lot more complex negotiations, because it is indeed a war of ideologies. It's a war of ideologies, and Ukraine just happens to be the battlefield. In all of this.
Let me bring you to something that may make us that may bring us a bit closer to home, and that is the grain deal that Turkey and the United Nations negotiated with Russia and Ukraine, which saw grain get out of Ukraine and go to other parts of the world, including countries that import a lot of grain and which would have a food crisis if they didn't get those imports. One of those countries, of course, is you and I's country, Nigeria. Now, that grain deal is up for renewal on Saturday. The current deal will expire on Saturday, the 18th. The Russians have said, look, we're prepared to extend this, but our concerns have not been addressed from the last renewal. The United Nations and Turkey are working on those concerns, but it does look as if there might be another brinkmanship about to happen over that deal. Today is already Wednesday, and we're talking of Saturday.
Yeah. So this grain deal, has been one of the very bright sides of this. In all of this conflict, it has been one of the very bright sides. And like you said, the Russians have said that they are willing to extend the deal for, I think, 60 days or so. After it expires on the 18th. But of course they have raised concerns that that their own agricultural products, and exports of the agricultural products and all of that has not, conditions in that regard have not been met. So it appears that if these are not met, in the next day or two, that they could also become a challenge. There could be a challenge in the Black Sea region, and the Ukrainian ports might be forced to shut down because the Russians would not allow them to export anymore from, or they will not comply with the grain deal anymore. So I think it is very, very important that that Turkey, the United Nations particularly, and of course other allies that see this deal as some ray of hope, because that is what it is essentially, as some ray of hope in all of this dark incident that is going on between Russia and Ukraine. I think that they should come to the table, and in the next few days, broker some kind of compromise that would keep Russia at at a comfortable place, to continue to be part of this Green Deal as much as possible. Because if that goes south, then the implications, of course, will be very widely felt.
Indeed. Thank you so very much for your perspective, Dr. Michael Ogo of the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the Babcock University in Elisha Remo. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Ukraine's top military command is unanimously in favor of defending the sector of eastern Ukraine, including the besieged city of Bakhmut, and inflicting maximum losses on the enemy. Mr. Zelensky also spoke about his conversation with Robert Murdoch, chairman of News Corporation and Fox Corporation, on the anniversary of the deaths of 2 Fox News journalists in the Kyiv region while they were reporting on the conflict.
Провів сьогодні засідання ставки, доповіді главкома.
Today, I held the Commander-in-Chief's meeting. There were reports from the Commander-in-Chief of Armed Forces, reconnaissance, theater commanders. The main focus of attention, there was a clear position of the entire command. Strengthen this sector and destroy the occupiers to the maximum. Today as well, I spoke with Mr. Murdoch, the co-chairman of News Corp, one of the leading media outlets of the United States of America. A year ago on this day, precisely in Horintsy of Kyiv region, a group of journalists came under Russian fire. They were working for Fox News. This is when Pierre Zakrzewski and Alexander Kushinova perished. Benjamin Hall was seriously wounded. Overall, in a little more than a year, dozens of media people were killed or wounded. We cherish every life, and we remember every one of them. By remembering them, by remembering all those whose life and health were taken by this war, we're trying to do our best to bring an end to this Russian aggression.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian troops fired the 120mm guns of their Leopard tanks at a German shooting range a few days before they were due to return home with the Leopards. They hope will give Kyiv a breakthrough in what has become a grinding war of attrition. Muzzle flashes could be seen and dust clouds where the shells hit the ground as 4 tanks fought their way through a muddy dip to what was marked as an enemy position 2 kilometers away, destroying wooden pop-up targets as they rattled along. The commander of the EU training mission, Vice Admiral Hervé Briand, says Kyiv's forces were facing the most dangerous phase since Russia's invasion more than a year ago, holding the front line against what he described as a tsunami of more than 300,000 Russian combatants. And the United Nations Security Council has taken up a debate on Russophobia. Russia had requested the open meeting to discuss allegations of Russophobia and how it is allegedly impeding a resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. Ukraine's UN Chancellor Sergei Jovnik drew parallels between Nazi Germany and the current Russian regime.
The use of the word Russophobia, the claim that Ukrainians are ill rather than that they are experiencing an atrocity, is colonial rhetoric, and it's a part of a larger practice of hate speech. That is why this session is important. In Russia's genocidal hate speech, the idea that Ukrainians have a disease called Russophobia is used as an argument to destroy them, along with the arguments that they are vermin, parasites, Satanists, and so on. Claiming to be the victim when you are in fact the aggressor is not part of the defense. It's actually part of the crime. Hate speech directed against Ukrainians is not part of the defense of the Russian Federation. It's part of the crimes that Russian citizens are committing on Ukrainian territory.
The Nazis made allegations of oppressions against Germans abroad one of the centerpieces of their propaganda. False claims about discrimination of Germans were used as a justification for the aggressive expansionism, annexations, and atrocities. So many similarities with the Russian course of action, including here in the Security Council, make it clear that the Kremlin criminal regime should also find itself in the docks after the military defeat in Ukraine. It will be up to the future tribunal to establish the accountability of all responsible for issuing criminal orders, implementing these orders, and whitewashing them for internal and international audiences.
The problem in Ukraine today is not caused by Russophobia. It is caused by President Putin's desire to annex a sovereign nation in breach of the most fundamental principles of the Charter. So when the Russian state complains about Russophobia, what they actually object to, very simply, is Ukraine's determination that it should remain an independent nation, its refusal to bend to Russia's will and to give Russia its land.
An allegation about discrimination never justifies any use of force. If anything, unlawful Russian invasion of Ukraine might actually have given rise to harmful rhetoric and incitement towards those who align themselves with the unjustifiable aggression. As articulated in the General Assembly Resolution ES11/6, we reiterate our demand for immediate, complete, and unconditional Russian withdrawal of all of its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, and call for a cessation of hostilities.
The Russian delegation called this meeting today by claiming Russophobia is, and I quote, one of the most gruesome and repulsing aspects of the Ukrainian crisis. Are we to take this statement seriously as Russian missiles rain down on Ukrainian cities and kill civilians? As Russian forces have committed crimes against humanity, including the systematic rape, murder, and torture of civilians? There's a better word for such a statement in English, which includes Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov's claim at a G20 meeting earlier this month that this war was somehow launched against Russia and not the other way around. That word is gaslighting.
Russia's defense minister Sergei Shoigu has ordered a top Russian arms manufacturer to double its production of high-precision rockets. Speaking from a weapons production factory in Moscow, Mr. Shoigu said that increasing production will naturally reduce labor costs, adding that new additional products will also be made available. The minister announced the order during a visit to a tactical missiles corporation, adding that Russia will have, in addition to what it already has, maximum production. And President Vladimir Putin has inspected an M1171A2 helicopter simulator in Ulan-Ude, taking the controls of a helicopter flight simulator for a short flight. Earlier on, Mr. Putin hailed what he described as Russia's economic strength in the face of Western sanctions and the fallout from Moscow's military campaign in Ukraine. And President Putin claims that last year's blasts on the Nord Stream gas pipeline had been carried out on a state level, dismissing the idea of an autonomous pro-Ukraine group being responsible as complete nonsense. In his words, the terrorist act quite obviously was committed at the state level because no amateurs can commit such an action. Who is interested? Theoretically, the United States is interested in stopping the supply of Russian energy carriers to European energy markets and supplying volumes of its own, including liquefied natural gas, even if it is much, 25-30% than the Russian one. And while in Buryatia, President Putin has hailed what he described as Russia's economic strength in the face of Western sanctions and the fallout from Moscow's military campaign. Speaking at length to workers at an aviation factory, Mr. Putin expanded on his familiar argument that the West was bent on pulling Russia apart. He told the workers in response to a question that he had been worried about the economy when the West imposed unprecedented waves of sanctions last year, but it had proved stronger than expected.
We have increased our economic sovereignty many times over. After all, what did our enemy count on? that we would collapse in 2 to 3 weeks or in a month. That's what they were counting on. The calculations were that businesses would come to a halt because of the refusal of our partners to work together with us in the economy. The financial system would collapse and thousands of people, tens of thousands, would be out of work, would take to the streets and protest. Russia would sway from within and collapse. That is what they counted on. This did not happen. It turned out for many of us, and even more so for Western countries, that the fundamental foundations of Russia's stability are much stronger than anyone thought.
The European Commission has proposed a revamp of Europe's electricity market rules to try to increase the use of fixed-price power contracts, shield consumers from price spikes, and speed up the shift to renewable energy. The European Union said last year it would overhaul its electricity market over cuts to Russian gas supplies following Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, which drove European power prices to record highs, forcing industries to close and hiking household bills. The Commission's proposals included incentives for contracts that lock in stable long-term power prices to make consumers' electricity bills less exposed to short-term swings in fossil fuel prices.
The dominance of the short-term market has amplified the effects of the gas price rise and has been the source of various problems during the crisis. And this has been felt by consumers who have been exposed to wholesale prices that are too often dictated by the price of gas-fired power plants. And they have not been able to benefit from the growing share of lower-cost renewables. The reform will aim to make the energy bills of the European consumers and companies more independent from the short-term market prices. To decouple consumer prices from the short-term markets, we propose to expand the role of long-term instruments. We introduce measures to boost the market for power purchase agreements and enhance the flexibility of the electricity system through storage and demand response measures.
And when we return, the International Olympic Committee is asking the United Kingdom to respect the autonomy of sports. Details in a moment. Do join us again. All right, a warm welcome back. Laddie Williams is here for more on the business stories. Morning, Laddie.
Good morning.
Good news, should I say? I don't know. You tell me.
Yeah.
The US CPI data met analysts' forecasts.
Exactly. And obviously, everyone's holding their breath. Most investors in the market thinking, oh, if this data comes in hotter than expected, then we can expect the US Fed will go,
bonkers on the rate hikes.
Exactly, with the rate hike. So it came in good, 0.4% for February compared to about 0.5% in January. So, and it did land on the 6% mark that Dow Jones actually forecasted. So it's a good sign, and most of that is due to energy costs, coming down, and some components in the U.S. economy, like housing prices and all of that. So that contributed to the slowdown. We saw about 6%. So it's still, it remains to be seen what happens next, because it's still far away from the U.S. target of about 2%. So markets are already, loving this, but we are expecting that anything can happen this meeting.
You see, markets are loving it.
Yeah, they're loving it.
So how are we seeing that? They're coming out with good figures.
Yeah, so yesterday we saw major markets in the U.S. did close in the green. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, S&P 500, and the NASDAQ, all in the green. And we saw the Bitcoin market too. That also went well, yeah. About 25,000. And then the early morning trade today from, yesterday. So it's showing that investors are quite bullish, with this news. But at the same time, there is some, caution in there, because we could, get a surprise from the Fed.
Right.
Everyone's pricing in now that it's going to be 25 basis points, at the next meeting.
But supposing it's 50.
there was talks about 50 basis points.
Yeah, because I heard some of that.
Yeah, so, and we saw the bank stocks, that were hammered from last week into yesterday. The bank stocks have recovered in the U.S., so that's, some sigh of relief there. It's like the investors have shrugged off the whole Silicon Valley Bank drama. So, but the issues are still there. We're still trying to battle inflation at this time.
Well, it's also good news for Russia. Its unemployment rate dropped. Many people will have their mouths open at that information.
Yeah. Some people will be surprised, obviously, and we do have analysts that say, most of the data coming out from Russia, you can't really
you take it with a dose.
Exactly. So, but it's good news. It's showing that the economy is still resilient, even
which
with
is what the Russian president was talking about a couple of minutes ago.
He was saying that everyone expected the economy would have gone under by now, but they've stayed resilient. And even though we've seen the exodus of companies out of Russia, we're still seeing unemployment rate at a record low. So it's a good sign for them. But we know the cracks are still there, with
Very
the economy, because it's not easy having to deal with all these, global sanctions from the U.S. and its allies. So, at the end of the day, but when you were having that conversation about the whole drone drama and having to happen on the Black Sea, everyone's looking at that Black Sea deal now.
The grain deal, which is why I ended that discussion with that question. That there's a question mark.
Yeah, why did it have to be on the Black? Black
which is
sea,
where these ships are supposed to pass through to get to Turkey, be examined, and then head for wherever they're supposed to go.
It's a little, iffy. Why is it happening there?
Now.
And now, at the same time, because we're trying to get that deal. We have till Saturday, got that 60-day extension. But I'm sure, everyone is watching, closely now to see what happens next. We don't want an escalation, out of this.
And then, no surprises here, and this is in good news. Ukraine's economy shrank by almost 30%.
Yeah, almost 30%.
In 2022.
Yeah, and expectation was actually 30% and higher.
And more, right.
More, but it's 29.2%, so we'll take that.
This qualifies as good news, then?
Yes, we'll take that as, good news, because this is a country at war, and they've been able to, weather the storm, with the support from the U.S. and the allies, and, seeing the grain deal also helping
quite
them.
A lot of people have poured in money into Ukraine, the EU, the US, the UK, and all of that. So quite a lot of money.
Quite a lot of money, and
to limit the damage to this.
That's what's helping them, stay afloat at this time. So now all eyes on 2023. What to expect? The war is still on, still a country at war. So, and as long as the support keeps coming in
and at
Ukraine,
the pace at which it has been coming.
Yeah, so we should see some kind of improvement in 2023, hopefully, and the war ends, hopefully.
That's the prime one.
Yeah.
Ladi, of course, and his team will have details of these and other stories on the business front right after this on Business Morning and later on Business Inc. Thanks, Ladi.
Thank you.
Poland could give Ukraine a MiG-29 fighter jets in the coming 4 to 6 weeks, and that's according to Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki, suggesting that Kiev's allies were moving closer to an agreement on the next step in their military support for that country. Poland has said it would be prepared to send the Soviet-designed MiG-29 jets to Ukraine as part of a coalition of countries. However, with Kiev's allies taking a cautious approach to the transfer of fighter jets, it has been unclear how long such a process might take. And finally, on the program, the International Olympic Committee has urged the United Kingdom government to respect the autonomy of sport after an attempt to lobby sponsors against Russian and Belarusian athletes participating at next year's Paris Games. Last week, UK Culture Secretary Lucy Fraser wrote a letter to 13 of the biggest Olympic sponsors, urging them to pressure the IOC to abandon its plan to allow Russian and Belarusian competitors. But the IOC argued that it is not up to governments to decide which athletes can participate in which international competitions, as this would be the end of world sport as we know it today. The IOC adds that the Olympic sponsors are not involved in this decision-making process. That's our program this morning. Thanks for being with us. My name is Ladi Akiri Duluale. There'll be updates of these and other stories throughout the day, but especially within the world today at 5 o'clock. You'll watch out for that. But for now, have a pleasant midweek ahead. Good morning.